The purpose of the Global CFO Council is to provide an educational and networking forum for senior financial executives in order to share best practices, discuss current financial issues, and to learn about current topics related to the performance of their jobs.
L'Oreal, I don't read bios. I find things on the interwebs, and then I read them to you before you're about to start. So, L'Oreal Giles is the VP of Research and Thought Leadership at the IMA, and I think you're based out of California. Is that correct?
I am.
Before that, 14, maybe 15 years at BP and an amazing progression of awesome positions with that organization. And I think that was your first job out of college.
It was.
In college, I think you worked your way through college while working at McDonald's. Is that true?
That is the truth. Loved every minute of it.
Also, before even that, worked as an assistant filing paperwork and tax returns at your father's tax business.
Yes, that was the first one.
Got an undergraduate degree in accounting from Southern University. Graduated in 3 years, I might add.
Did. Look at you knowing all the good things.
MBA from Tulane University and currently pursuing a doctorate of business administration from Pepperdine.
Yes.
I think, gosh, I don't know if this one's true. I think, did you graduate high school from St. Mary High School in Louisiana?
I did not. So that was not true.
Darn it. All right.
No worries.
Well, then I won't show the high school graduation picture of someone that isn't you.
How thoughtful of you.
You're the former IMA Global Board Director. You're a Cal CPA Trailblazer Award winner, Scrum Master Certification, super volunteer in organizations like the ACBSP and NABA, member of a Chief Group, which is a cool new group that I've been hearing a lot about on the interwebs, often and frequent speaker and writer. I kind of a little bit of a I don't know. I just love reading your articles in strategic finance, I guess is an easy way to say it.
Yeah.
Often speak about financial transformation, agile, organizational agility, and RPA. And we are very lucky to have you here today because it sounds like multi-years of research, thousands and thousands of responses globally on a really important topic, and love to have you share some of your findings with our group today.
Awesome. Is that my cue?
I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to delete the high school graduation picture of someone that isn't you.
Thanks so much. We sure appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here. That was a wonderful intro. The one slide that I have after this one won't do any of that justice, so it'll give you a whopping 2 bullets about me. But what I'm excited about today is we'll talk about global accounting talent. We have been on a 2-year journey to research DE&I within the global accounting profession, and I'm delighted to share the findings that we have found over the last couple of years with this audience, particularly a group of leaders within the profession. Again, my 2 bullets here won't do any of the other intro justice, so I won't spend much time here. My passion is how do we, one, marry I'd say digital technology with accounting. So that's my first passion. And the second passion is how do we ensure that we're ready for the future of our profession? And in getting ready for the future of our profession, there's a big angle of the digital technology side, which is what I often talk about, but there's also what talent do we need? What capabilities do we need as we look at the talent that makes up the profession? And the component of that transformation lens is who do those people need to be? And that's where the diversity component comes from in my space. So what we'll talk about first, let's just introduce the research, and then we'll talk about some of the findings in the first half of today's session. In February of 2021, I am with IMA, the Institute of Management Accountants. We partnered with the California Society of CPAs, and we had tons of support within the US, and we conducted an initial study of DE&I in the US accounting profession. After that study, IMA teamed up with IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, and we worked with them and Cal CPA to sponsor 3 additional studies. One in the Asia Pacific region, one in Europe and the Mediterranean, and one in the Middle East and North Africa. Those 4 studies included analysis of more than 8,500 survey responses and from current and former accounting professionals, as well as interviews for more than 100 accounting, human resources, and DE&I practitioners and academics. What you see on the screen here is the report cover. You'll be able to access that report cover. I'll show the link at the end, but for your benefit now, it's myima.org/DEI solutions. Anyone can access that for free. You can download it and check out the results in more detail. So in this report, we cover 2 primary things. The first, we look at catalysts for DE&I action. We wanted to talk through why do we need to make this change in the first place? Why do we need DE&I action? And then the second piece of that is what solutions can we implement? What action can we take? And so we'll start in today's session, part 1, with catalysts for DE&I action. As we start with the first, this notion of I'd say current state, we wanted to say, one, what's the current state of DE&I? And that's what we aim to accomplish with the first 4 studies. We looked across different regions within the world and said, what is our current state of DE&I? And so we'll go into a deeper dive of that in the next couple of slides. We also said we have a responsibility to protect the public interest as accounting and finance professionals, particularly if we're certified. Then there's this notion that we have an ethical obligation. And then the third piece that we identified as a catalyst for action is this increasing demand for sustainable business information around DE&I. So we'll start with the first one, the current state of DE&I. There are 3 key findings that I think are worth highlighting, and they're rather telling as we describe the current state of DE&I. Although progress has been made with diversity across all regions, our research uncovered a diversity gap, greater diversity across the broader profession than in leadership positions. And as we explored perceptions of equity and inclusion, we also noted that fewer than 60% of our respondents view the profession as equitable and inclusive. And when we looked to understand why, we asked, why is diverse talent not rising to the top leadership ranks of our profession? Diverse talent told us that they aren't advancing because of inequity and exclusion. And so let's peel back the layers of that onion just a bit. As we look into the diversity gap further, in the first study that we conducted for the US, we uncovered the diversity gap at senior levels, the low presence of diverse talent among senior leadership ranks in comparison to the demographic diversity across the profession. So an example of that, a tangible example, 62% women in the US accounting workforce, but in senior leadership ranks, we see the likes of 20% in CFO roles or 13 to 14% in partner ranks in CPA firms. And so we saw evidence of that diversity gap in other regions as well. But what was even more pronounced in some of the countries we studied, which was similar to what we saw with racial and ethnic groups in the US, is this low presence of diverse talent within the profession in comparison to the population within that location. And so pause there to think we've got a diversity gap that can manifest in 2 different ways. One, at the senior leadership level, so greater diversity in the profession than you see at leadership ranks. And then one, broadly across the profession relative to what we see in the population of that specific location. As we think about the diversity gap and we dug deeper to understand why, diverse talent across each region studied reports they are not advancing in the profession because of inequity and exclusion. And while we explored multiple demographic groups in each region, the female demographic group is the one that we examined across all 4 regional studies. So you'll see in some of the studies that you look at, we also covered race and ethnicity, we covered disabilities, and some we also covered sexual orientation and others. And so that's a bit different for each region, but we did cover the female demographic in each. And so I'll give some of the global highlights from the female respondents. More than 40% of female respondents in each region studied, and as many as 73% of women in the US cite instances of bias that affected recruitment, assignments, peer-to-peer interactions, promotions, compensation, mentoring, sponsorship opportunities. And as we looked at that, they cited certain factors like women don't consistently receive fair treatment in the recruitment process, Women said they don't have equitable access to sponsors or mentors within their organization, and that in some instances, excuse me, leaders demonstrate unfair prejudice or bias against women that negatively affects promotion. And there's greater emphasis on recruitment than retention of women. So I will drink water as I flip to the next slide. Thank you for bearing with me. The next piece of that is DE&I is affecting diverse talent retention within companies and the profession. And so female respondents in this instance report that DE&I issues have directly contributed to decisions to leave a job and to move on to another opportunity while working in the accounting profession. And you can see some of those findings on the screen. Our study found that on average, 42% of female respondents across all regions we studied have left a company due to a perceived lack of equitable treatment or inclusion. And that turnover rate is highest among women in the Middle East and North Africa, where 54% report leaving an employer due to a lack of equitable treatment. The piece that's even more astonishing to me, beyond people leaving a company, is people that made the decision to leave the profession altogether. And some of that we're able to ascertain through not going directly through an accounting firm per se to do the research, but going through these associations where someone may be a CPA, maybe a CMA, and so they're still a member of an association, but they've now decided to take a different career path. And so in addition to an average of 38% of female respondents reporting that negative DE&I experiences impacted their career decisions across all regions, as you can see on the screen, 12% of women indicate that inequitable and exclusive experiences contributed to their decision to leave the profession altogether. And the opportunity cost to the accounting profession of a lack of good DE&I practices is significant. If we're losing talent, there's higher turnover within organizations. We're losing talent across the profession as well. We have what's characterized sometimes as a leaky talent pipeline. And access to the best talent, of course, is paramount to the profession's ability to deliver value in the future. And maintaining this access requires attracting and retaining talent of all backgrounds, not just women, but talent of all backgrounds. Experience is highlighted through the research that we heard in over 100 interviews in some of the open text survey responses reveals that inequity and exclusion persists today. So there weren't all historical reports of this. Some of it was incredibly contemporary. And diverse talent leaving the profession altogether because of that lack of DE&I. So we used those pieces of evidence to conclude that the current state of DE&I serves as one of the key catalysts for the global accounting profession to take action in DE&I spaces. And the other two catalysts that we talk about will go to ethics now. The profession, I'd say the profession, as we look at the accountants that sit within the profession, we have an obligation to protect the public interest and an ethical imperative even to maintain honesty and integrity, committing to fair decisions free from bias. And that notion of protecting the public interest is one of the most well-known and I'd say long-standing responsibilities of professional accountants. And it serves as a key impetus for the profession's action toward DE&I progress. It's our responsibility to adhere to a code of ethics with requirements that are at least as stringent as those that we see in the International Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants that IASBA puts out, the International Ethics Standards Board of Accountants. And so the AICPA complies to IASBA's code, IMA complies to IASBA's code. And in those scenarios, we have ethical responsibilities that include acting with integrity and upholding objectivity, which involves mitigating the risk of bias affecting decisions and professional judgments. So to that end, beyond applicability to accountants' treatment of other business professionals or how we conduct ourselves personally, the obligations also extend to how we treat each other. And that's the umbrella under which DE&I falls in this component. The last catalyst for action that we'll cover in this half of the session today is this sustainability notion. There is increased demand for sustainable business information around DE&I. A further extension of our well-established ethical obligation is this evolving role of accountancy that increasingly encompasses reporting of sustainable business information, commonly referred to as ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And the new reporting standards and guidelines that we've seen emerging in recent past include informational and human resources capital, including DE&I, which falls under the S of ESG. Examples of that, a host of governments, securities regulators, and accounting standard setting bodies are bringing attention and new mandates for organizational transparency, particularly around people in leadership roles. You see mandates for disclosure of board diversity. Some of that's happening at the C-suite level now and is then being distilled down across the organization. Some of that you can see in the transparency reports that have come out from the Big Four and others. As we dive a bit deeper into the ESG space, in 2015, the United Nations member states unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. Of the 17 SDGs, several have elements that directly relate to DE&I practices. And I've called those 5 out on the screen here: quality education, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, reduced inequalities, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. So what I've done in this segment is talk through the 3 key catalysts for action, why we need to have any DE&I change in the first place, one being the current state of DE&I, our ethical obligation, that ethical imperative we have to make decisions free from bias, and then this increasing demand for sustainable information around DE&I. That brings us to part 2 and is a wonderful place to pause to see if we've got any questions.
We do. I'm going to hit you rapid fire with
Go for it.
a handful of them. One is, you mentioned, I think it was 60% of grads are female and significantly less are in senior leadership positions in the accounting profession. I think maybe like 20%. What were some of the drivers of the drop-off points, or I think you called it leaks? Any career points, or is it around license? What are some of those drivers or drop-off points?
Certainly. So I'll clarify the stat just for a moment. 62% of the profession, so not necessarily of grads, but of the profession that we have in the US is female. And if you look in our US study, myima.org/US DEI, then you can see all those stats called out from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. As we think about the leaks and the prompts for the leaks, what we saw is a considerable drop off in middle management. So it wasn't, for females in particular, it wasn't the certification as a barrier. We saw certification as a barrier when we looked at racial and ethnic groups, but not for females in particular. And we saw the biggest drop off at middle management levels. We saw that women were rising to middle management ranks and staying there for decades, for 1 decade, 2, 3 decades, depending on how long they've been in the profession. And a lot of that was around unfair, as reported by the respondents, unfair promotion practices and inequity in promotion practices, not getting access to the development opportunities that some of their peers got.
You mentioned that some will take a different career path. Is there anything in particular that stood out, that this type of new career, like where are the folks going?
Yes.
Any findings?
Definitely. So when we looked at racial and ethnic minorities in the US, we found that amongst Black accountants, they left for entrepreneurial paths. Also, for some females, left for entrepreneurial paths, and that was the largest drop-off that we saw. As people left the profession, they went to pursue entrepreneurship. And it's interesting because our profession provides a path to entrepreneurship. You can have your own CPA firm. You can start a consulting business and not decide to be a CMA, be a CMA, and consult with firms from an internal perspective. And so I think this notion that DE&I contributing to people leaving the profession for entrepreneurship, when entrepreneurship is an option here, is quite telling as well.
L'Oreal, how do the IMA data and your findings compare or contrast to other fields? Maybe you have peers in other industries of professional services. Are there similarities? If if maybe you were to think about engineers or other fields, any known similarities or any contrasts?
Definitely. We've had some of those conversations with Thomson Reuters because they look at the legal field and the accounting field. And so we see great similarities in the legal profession. They have similar drop off points at a certain point, kind of toward the middle part of the trajectory from a career perspective, amongst racial and ethnic minorities, as well as with females. And we see something similar in STEM fields. The caveat that I'll offer with STEM is I think STEM is now doing a much better job than many fields that suffer from the same problem in attracting diverse talent. They still face some of the issues that we have in the accounting profession from a talent retention perspective and have quite some ways to go there, but they've started targeting youth at a much younger age as you think about organizations like Girls Who Code and a host of other opportunities to expose young children in elementary school or primary school, as we might call it in other areas. As we target those students to get more exposure to STEM fields, I think our accounting profession has a ways to go in ensuring that we start younger, getting that exposure to the profession as well.
L'Oreal, where would information on Latin America or South America in particular be found within your findings?
So it's not represented here. What we're considering is doing it as a complete study devoted to Latin America. We didn't believe that it could be coupled with what we did here. We believed it deserved its own study, similar to India, which we're planning to do a separate study for. So it's not in the findings that you see here, but it is on the horizon.
And I know I think we talked and you said this is the fifth in a series. How many regions are represented?
So we have the US is the only country, I'll say, that's represented in North America. We also covered Europe and the Mediterranean, and that's with about, I'd say, 10 or 12 countries across Europe and the Mediterranean. In Asia Pacific, we covered a host of countries in Southeast Asia, as well as Australia and Japan. And then in the Middle East and North Africa, we covered Egypt, as well as the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Lebanon. And so a lot of those are represented there as well.
I'm thinking in the breadth of countries covered that there's some degree or a lot of degree or a little bit of degree of cultural differences, maybe even language or vocabulary. How do you handle that when doing a global survey like that?
Yes.
Do you handle it? Do you equivalize anything, or do you ask the exact same questions? How do you make sure it's being translated the right way? Just stuff like that.
That's a great question. So part of the reason we partnered with other organizations is so that we could leverage their local expertise of their market. So we partnered with the Japan Institute of CPAs, for example, and in many of these countries, we had our survey translated. In each region, we had research advisors that had to review the survey before it could be distributed within that market. So we had academic and practitioner research advisors who specialize in survey research, and we wanted people that were local within the market. So we didn't want all US people deciding what the content should be in an Asia Pacific study, for example. So we have representation of research advisors, many of which with PhDs in the accounting profession, but that are represented, for example, in Indonesia and Australia and Japan. And so their expertise was leveraged prior to us distributing any surveys to anyone.
Two more for this phase. One, I'm going to combine a couple questions for folks. Any positive surprises in your findings, maybe some trends that are looking up, or any industries or fields where there's been some D&I progress?
Absolutely. I think there were a ton of really good things happening. And what we did in this report, which we'll talk about in the next part of today's session when we talk about solutions, there's an inventory of best practices. And there are 79 practices that an organization can implement that are included in this study. Those came from people who are doing this right. We didn't make them up. And that was intentional because we wanted to tell the story of the progress that is being made. And where we found an organization that was doing something amazing, we gave that organization the credit. We listed, here are the 5 organizations that are doing this one really good thing. you might want to leverage this in your region. And so I think within the accounting profession, we have amazing things going on, and we'll give some examples of some of those. So I'll hold them in about 15 minutes or so. And I'll just use that to say, the one thing that we didn't see is partnership of those really good things. And so we might see one organization doing something amazing. And if it's a state society in the US, it benefits the members of their state in the accounting profession, people in their state, youth in their state. But imagine a world where 20 of the US states did that same thing, or where another country said, oh, we would be able to benefit from that. We're not looking at race and ethnicity, perhaps, but we might be able to leverage that for females. And so I think what we wanted to do was amplify the really good things that are happening, and that's what's done with the bulk of this report.
Final question for this section is around org structure. Those organizations that are thinking about or have a D&I leader, what's the best practice in org structure where that person should reside?
Oh, that's a good question. So this is in one of our practices, if memory serves me correctly, in the inventory. We recommend a couple of things. One, to have some sort of advisory committee for DE&I. And I start with that, a volunteer-led advisory committee for DE&I, that where the composition of that committee is diverse persons. And I think that's important. And the DE&I leader within the organization, our research has shown, should be able to oversee that group and amplify the voices and the perspective of that group as they implement things within the organization. From an org structure perspective, we've seen a couple of models that work. And so I'll call those out, but I don't know that the reporting line is the most important piece, as it is executive buy-in. Executive sponsorship, serving as a champion. And so we've seen instances where the chief diversity officer reports directly to the CEO. We've seen other instances where it's embedded within the human resources function, or there's a human resources function and there's some, whatever the equivalent of the chief HR leader is, and there's a single solid line of reporting for the chief diversity officer to that person, as opposed to embedded within the human resources function. We've seen lots of complaints, for what it's worth, of diversity being embedded within HR, as in, oh, you've already got an HR function, let us just name one of you the diversity leader and keep doing what you're doing. And what we see, the risk we run with that, is we don't get as much training for those diversity leaders. We don't ensure that they have access to the resources that they need. And in any of those org structures, we've seen it doesn't matter if you don't have executive sponsorship, visible executive sponsorship, and the CEO, the most senior person in the organization, and their leadership team serving as visible champions for the initiatives as well.
Well, I'm excited for some of these findings and recommendations and actionable solutions. So I'm going to mute myself and hold the rest of the questions until
All right. Good. So let's get into it. So with the first 4 studies, our goal was to say, how do we have this conversation with the data about where we stand today? And that's what we covered in the first part of this session today. And we didn't feel that we should talk about solutions in depth until we knew where we stood. And that's why we wanted to do kind of these 4 studies before we ever got to detailed solutioning. And what you'll see here, what we found out, and I'll cover this one slide before we do the deep dive into solutions. What we found out is there are some key inhibitors to progress for DE&I. The specific demographic groups that were addressed by various DE&I research initiatives typically differ based on location, religious affiliation, or appetite for DE&I progress, but many institutions, corporate, academic, or nonprofit, already have some form of DE&I related strategy, policy, initiative in place. And even if some of that is just because you have to comply with anti-discrimination laws and regulations within your area, unfortunately, even some of the most well-intentioned initiatives are unsuccessful or don't yield the amount of progress that's needed. And our research identified 5 key reasons DE&I efforts have been unsuccessful, inhibiting sustained DE&I progress. And those are First, not having diversity as a true priority within the organization. Diversity initiatives are sometimes kind of treated as an add-on. Multiple study participants across all of the regions indicated that DEI doesn't consistently receive dedicated resources or defined key performance indicators for progress that's comparable to other strategic, operational, or financial priorities that the organization might have. Another is implicit bias negatively affects decisions and behavior. There's overt discrimination, which can often be addressed through internal human resources and incident reporting mechanisms. But the implicit biases are major contributors to the perpetuation of discrimination. And discrimination, I'd say, or the effects of implicit bias, which manifest as microaggressions or stereotypes, commonly show up as unfair recruitment and promotion practices. So some of what we were talking about in the Q&A there. And those practices disadvantage members of certain demographic groups that may already be underrepresented. Another we saw is there's a lack of role models, mentors, and sponsors for diverse talent. Role models have proven essential to introducing youth to the profession. And the Center for Audit Quality did a study in 2021, so just last year, and that was with nearly 4,000 US high school and college student survey respondents. The study participants in the Center for Audit Quality's work indicated mentors and role models are those with the greatest influence on career choice among students of all ethnicities. And I think that's important, and it speaks also to how young that decision is, how young people are when that decision about career is being made. It's well before senior year in high school for many people, which is when some of our professions, including accounting, typically start the conversation. Another we saw as DE&I is viewed as a short-term plan rather than a cultural shift. Often diversity programs are standalone initiatives with plans developed for a finite period, and that inhibits progress as equity and inclusion improvements are not achieved and sustained by temporary initiatives, but by long-term, genuine efforts, I'd say, particularly to foster this culture of belonging, to ensure equitable access to opportunities. None of this can be resolved overnight. And so short-term efforts are unlikely to sustain any progress that they may make. And lastly, some believe no DE&I action is needed. And we wanted to call that one out in particular because in certain regions, we had a decent size of the population, albeit minority of the population. So I'd say in the, depending on the region, 5 to 10% range, where people said, I don't think we need to do any of this. We don't need to do any DE&I efforts. We don't need any initiatives for DE&I. It's outside of the realm for accountants, and a blind meritocracy will solve everything that we have. And the point that we had as we engaged in really meaningful conversations with people who had those views, that the conversations we had were, well, the meritocracy is the goal. Unfortunately, it's not the reality that we live in across the board. And so we wanted to figure out what equity looks like is not handing out the best assignments or handing out the best promotion opportunities just because of someone's demographic composition. It's more ensuring that people who may not be aware of the opportunities have access to those opportunities, heightening their awareness to those development opportunities, promotional opportunities, or otherwise. And the goal there being, as we are, I'd say, implement more targeted efforts to ensure that awareness is heightened, that those opportunities are available for all, then hopefully we get to a place where there are truly equal opportunities, and those equal opportunities yield the same results for everyone, which would be the ultimate objective. As we bear those things in mind, we looked at what solutions do we need to enact for change. Across the first 4 studies, we got these 4 themes of solutions. People said we need to raise awareness by identifying and mitigating unconscious bias so people of all backgrounds are recognized and valued. They said we need to attract diverse talent by promoting the profession as a desirable career path for people regardless of their background, drive career promotion by taking, I'd say, really targeted steps to ensure that people of diverse backgrounds, again, have equitable access to the factors that enable career advancement. Again, not this notion of handing out the assignments or the advancement opportunities. And lastly, increasing accountability for progress by defining transparently reporting and linking performance to DE&I metrics. So those were the key themes from the first 4 studies. The last study, we did a series of roundtables and focus groups that encompassed people from all of the regions that we looked at. And as we sought to prepare an inventory of actionable DE&I practices, we further distilled the categories of solutions down into one of 2 overarching categories that represent necessary strategic objectives for the accounting profession's DE&I efforts. And that's 1, attracting diverse talent, and 2, retaining and promoting diverse talent. So those 2, if you think back to the 4 that we had on the other screen, they're related, but what we saw is how can we put this in its simplest form? And these 2 strategic objectives emerged from the focus group conversations that we had. We then identified 5 long-term outcomes that were determined to be essential to accomplishing these 2 overarching objectives. As we look at attracting diverse talent, we identified heightened awareness of the profession as a viable and desirable career path for all as a critical component there, improved access and preparation for diverse persons to the accounting profession, persons of all backgrounds feeling welcome to the profession, fair and equitable hiring practices and recruitment processes, as well as increased number of diverse accounting faculty. And these 5 would apply, again, across the board to any of the regions that we looked at. The specific demographic area of focus might just differ depending on the geographic location or the cultural differences that we observe in those areas. As we shift focus to retaining and promoting diverse talent, the 5 long-term outcomes that we identified there: fair and equitable talent management processes, robust bias detection and mitigation processes, accountability through transparent reporting and communication, fostering a culture of belonging, and DE&I being treated as an ongoing strategic priority. The inventory in the report includes more than 70 actionable practices that individuals and organizations can implement today, and that's to achieve DE&I progress. The inventory serves as a resource to aid institutions and leaders in their efforts to assess the effectiveness of existing DE&I initiatives, to bolster DE&I programs and agendas, to avoid the inhibitors that we identified that are preventing DE&I progress, measuring progress toward DE&I goals, among a host of other things, ideally expanding requirements for DE&I disclosure through proposed indicators as well. And so where we'll shift now for the next couple of slides is giving you a glimpse into the inventory. What you see on the screen is an excerpt from the inventory of 79 actionable practices that have been called out. For this one, we focus on attracting diverse talent. For this example, the long-term outcome that's featured for the practice that's at the top: heightened awareness of the profession as a viable and desirable career path for all. And the practice that's recommended here: implementing communication, marketing, and awareness campaigns that highlight the benefits and intellectual rewards of accounting, that target the key motivations and strongest influencers of the target groups in career path selection, and tailor messages accordingly. So this is a wonderful example. There are a host of organizations that are already doing this in their areas, but we don't believe that it's had the widespread effect that we need because there aren't enough organizations operating in a coordinated manner to heighten awareness to the profession for demographic groups across the board. And so we called out a few specific organizations that are doing this: the Japan Institute of CPAs, we've got the Center for Audit Quality, a host of organizations within the US, the Illinois CPA Society. Many are already working on these targeted awareness campaigns. And we think it's incredibly important for those to turn into bigger partnerships where there's a concerted message similar to what you see across STEM fields. Another example under the Attract Diverse Talent objective is under the outcome: fair and equitable hiring and recruitment processes. anonymize or hire a consultant to anonymize resumes by scraping names and other details that can prompt discrimination from resumes prior to having them reviewed during the recruitment process to minimize the effects of bias. A company called Blendor is doing this today. They're providing this service. If you choose Blendor or someone else, internal or external, we're a bit indifferent to. But the point here being, in many instances, when you look at a resume, you can tell so much about a person demographically just by what's listed on the resume. And so this notion of, there's been research studies that conducted experiments that presented the same resume of all the exact same qualifications and simply changed the name. One was a name that sounded more like a female name, the other sounded more like a male name. And overwhelmingly, where the resume was for a male, the job was awarded. Where it was for a female, the job was awarded in that scenario. And so in research that we've seen, that's incredibly important. The same would exist with racial and ethnic minorities and a host of other groups. So this, again, while it applies to the accounting profession, this can, any organization can benefit from this practice. And there's a host of them that we include in there. We also map all of these practices to one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, multiple ones if it applies to those, so that as an organization identifies what they're doing today, then they can apply that to what progress they're making toward those SDGs as well when they're reporting that progress. As we look at retaining and promoting diverse talent, a couple of examples on the screen here for fostering a culture of belonging. We've talked about DE&I training for a long time, and what we found in the research is that most DE&I training is incredibly ineffective. And we thought it important to call out what are good strategies that we need to implement from a training perspective, so we're not just telling everyone, go train more people for DE&I or for bias. And so we've called out several related to training in the inventory. One that's incredibly important is it's an ongoing effort. It's not take this one training course one day and you never have to take another again. And so we recommend that it be an ongoing training program. But one of the exercises that we found particularly interesting from a group of researchers is employing something called perspective taking training. Those exercises would be this process of mentally walking in someone else's shoes. For underrepresented demographic groups, this could be males walking in the shoes of females. It could be different racial and ethnic groups walking in the shoes of another. And the exercise in this example could consider having participants write a few sentences imagining the distinct challenges of a marginalized minority. And if having that experience of having to write it down, not important that you read it to someone else, but just having that experience can improve pro-diversity attitudes and behavioral intentions toward those groups. Another example that we listed, regularly conducting a survey through anonymous data collection to assess the climate and the culture of the organization. And it's important that that happen over time. There are a few examples that we give in the inventory for what types of questions need to be asked in those surveys. So we definitely implore people to do that piece, because if you don't have the conversation, and some people won't be comfortable just talking about it, so those anonymous reporting measures would be really, really valuable, especially monitoring them over time to assess the employee sentiments toward DE&I. Where we'll go lastly and close here are a few specific actions. This is the official call to action for the section. So as you see on the left side there, action you can take now. We encourage you to read the report is the first thing. myima.org/DE&I solutions. If you want to see the US findings, it's the same part in the beginning, just US DEI. After that, the other regional reports will be coming, I believe, in July. And I will ensure that our wonderful host here has a link that will be updated once those are available as well, so you can access any of the regional reports that exist. So first, read the report. Identify which practices you're already performing is what we recommend. So the inventory is in the appendix. The actual report solely maybe 20 pages or so, but the inventory We recommend look through those practices, have someone in your team identify what you're already doing. You're probably already implementing some of these practices. And we think it's important to tell your success story. If you want to use some of those indicators and metrics that are there to measure your progress, how well it's going, then we encourage you to do that as well. And then the third call to action is adopt practices for outcomes aligned to your strategy. So we don't propose trying to implement 25 of the practices from the inventory. Pick 3 to 4 at most, ideally, that you believe you can have the greatest impact in within your organization, or that are most closely aligned to your strategy, and implement those, and leverage some of the other things that are in the document to measure progress against those. If you want to learn more about some of those practices, what we've also done is we've included a list of the organizations that are already implementing those practices. So you can go look in the back of the report. If you are with the Virginia Society of CPAs and you want to know about some really cool thing that's happening in the inventory, we've probably already told you, here's the other org that's working on it. So feel free to contact someone there. We do include their information as well. What we're already doing over to the right side, promoting DE&I opportunities in the profession. I'm with IMA. We're doing the same thing across Cal CPA and IFAC. We are facilitating partnerships with DE&I advocates, some of the 62 organizations across the globe who have signed on to this report, and we're collaborating for widespread DE&I improvement. If this is something your organization is interested in being a part of, feel free to reach out to me. Let me know, connect on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any additional questions that we might have in today's session, but hopeful that the material covered was beneficial to you.
We have a bunch. I'm going to hit you rapid fire. We got 9 questions in like
Let's
5
go.
minutes. So,
All right.
question number 1: if you are a normally underrepresented leader at an organization, or maybe you're a CFO of an organization with a D&I candidate you want to uplift, how do you balance that you could sometimes be overburden someone with being, hey, could you speak? Could you mentor? Could you lead?
Yes.
Could you lead an ERC?
Mm-hmm.
How do you support them and promote them and position them in leadership, but not burn them out? Like tip or trick in that. How do you do that?
That's a wonderful question. I think the only answer to that is these groups need more allies. So if this is the leader having the conversation, who's not the person that's underrepresented, then we need to be intentional about having more allies. And that's where championship, there's this misconception, I believe, as we went through the research, that it has to be someone from that demographic group that is able to enact the change or be the one that makes the progress. That's not true. How do we think women got to where they are? Because some man somewhere said women need to be in these roles. And so I think there's one element of, as leaders, especially CFOs, the CFO can serve as that champion, but also empower other allies. And the way that you do that is you give people volunteer opportunities, see who expresses that willingness. That's the other benefit of having those committees. Because then if you've got that volunteer DE&I committee within the organization, hopefully you can tap into multiple people to get to that state.
Any special advice for small companies? In the States, at least, 50% of private companies, so not like government entities, 50% of people work at private small businesses. So maybe we could only pull off 1 or 2 ideas. Do you have any specific recommendations? Like if you're only going to do 1 or you're only going to do 2 things at a small business, where would you steer someone to look?
I think if you're only going to do 2 things, then you pick one in the attracting diverse talent section. There is a bit about recruitment, how you ensure that you are recruiting diverse talent. Pick one practice from that section. If you can only pick one, and because you want to handle both ends of the pipeline, you want to make sure that you're attracting people. And so there are maybe 3 or 4 practices that you can pick from that talk about strategies that you can implement to ensure that you've got fair and equitable recruitment practices. Pick one from the 3 or 4 that are listed. And some of those would be things like ensuring that you're involved in the community, where it'll be different for every state, right? In some states, there's a greater focus on racial and ethnic minorities. Perhaps your state doesn't have the 60-ish% of females. So whatever that looks like for you, then I recommend picking the recruitment practices, and then on retaining and promoting, I'd say the most important thing is probably doing the survey. I think you have to do the survey if you do nothing else on retaining and promoting, because then the people within your organization will be able to tell you if you've got a culture of belonging, and invite them through open text survey questions to recommend what they want. And then you don't have what the masses think, you have what people in your organization think.
L'Oreal, you talked about attracting young people to the profession, and I chuckled a little bit because every time I talk to a young person about accounting, they go, "Yeah, hard pass." So, who somebody else needs to do something because I'm not
Yes.
effective. Like,
Yeah.
so hopefully the IMA's got this figured out because I'm crashing and burning 100%.
Yes. We need to talk about how cool our jobs are. That's the best way that I can say it. I think people, and not I think, I shouldn't say that, it's in the research. It's in our research, it's in the Center for Audit Quality's research, these perceptions of what youth have of accountants. If you think about young people, STEM is successful in part because of awareness, because people know who doctors are. They're all over the TV. There, you can see them there. People almost know who technologists are because you're using the technology. So they've got an easier sell. We don't walk around in the community and say, oh, there's an accountant. And we don't see them on the television, I'd say, featured in the really cool lights that we have. And so what IMA is doing specifically to fix this is we bring people that work for Google in accounting, or for Johnson & Johnson in accounting, or some of the really big names that are that people can connect to. And we have those young accountants tell their stories, talk about the really cool things, or the, what I'd say, really impactful things, the contributions that they have to things that people can relate to. And I think as we get more of those stories, whether it's in the great orgs or not, so to speak, as we talk about the impact of accountants to youth in a way that they can relate, then I think we'll be more successful.
L'Oreal, last question. I have a bunch that I'm not going to get to, but
Yeah.
if somebody is listening to this that say they're a high potential, maybe a young person who was attracted to the profession, and they're on the up, and they're also a diverse, normally unrepresented candidate, any recommendations for them? Call to action for the individual. How could they best position themselves for their career, their success? Maybe they can't solve the whole world's problems, but for them, for their life, any like top one or two recommendations you give to young people?
I'd say the first one is don't give up. You are valued, and we need you because there is a talent shortage across the globe, particularly in the US, but there's a talent shortage, period, before we even get to diverse people. So there's a talent shortage for accountants. The enrollment numbers are down in university for accountants. And so the first piece is don't give up. The second piece I would say is pay it forward. And I'll speak from personal experience there as a person who was a management accountant in a large organization who identifies as an underrepresented minority. I didn't give up, and I became my own champion as well. I doubled down and invested in development opportunities. When I saw those opportunities come up, I raised my hand, and I didn't want my demographic identification to speak for me, so I made sure that my work could. And that way it wasn't questioned why she got the role. She got it because she did a really good job. And that kind of segues into the pay it forward. I'm committed to paying it forward. I encourage others to be committed to doing the same.
Amen. And let's close on that. That is so strong. That's a call to action. There's 70 plus examples and action steps and metrics in these reports that are absolutely fantastic. I am going to send links to all of the studies that are provided in the resources that Lori and her team has put together. I'm also going to send out a copy of this presentation. And if for some crazy reason you are not a member of the IMA, you need to be. They're super cool. Speaking of cool accountants, the IMA is full of nothing but super cool accountants. I am a member. Bam. And if you're a CPA like me, guess what? That has nothing to do with your job. As a CFO, the CMA has everything to do with your job. And so let's say you've got 1 or 2 or 10 high potential team members that they're going to replace you when you retire. They need to be CMAs, and have them join the IMA, have them go to the IMA conferences where there are amazing speakers like myself, and get the CMA. It's awesome. And they got resources like this, links that I'm going to put together. And as L'Oreal said, clearly she's an excellent judge of character. She said, I am a wonderful host. Let's all remember that. That's a key takeaway. And give your time, talent, and money. Okay? Nobody else is going to fix this problem. We're going to fix this problem. So give your money and your time and your talent to organizations to help improve 1%, 0.5%. Every little bit helps. We all do it together. We can move forward. And the next time that L'Oreal puts this study together, we'll see a little bit of progress.
There we go.
Thank you all. Everyone have a wonderful day, and like, comment, and share my content on LinkedIn. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.